study. Let's stand together as we sing it. 547. Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart, not be all else to me save that thou art. Thou my best thought, by day or by night, waking or sleeping, thy presence my light. Be thou my wisdom, be thou my true word. I ever with thee, thou with me, Lord. Thou my great Father, I thy true Son. Thou in me dwelling, and I with thee one. Riches I heed not, nor man's empty praise. Thou my inheritance, now and always. Thou and thou only, first in my heart. High King of heaven, my treasure thou art. High King of heaven, when victory is won, may I reach heaven's joy so bright, heaven's sun. Heart of my own heart, whatever befall, still be my vision, O ruler of all. Father, we've sought you this morning. You said that when we seek you, we'd find you if we seek you with all our hearts. So now, Lord, with heart, mind, body, and in fellowship, we seek you. And we're asking that this day would be a blessing to us, a forwarding of understanding and truth, a deepening of fellowship. And we're just praying now for your guidance every step of the way. In Jesus' name, amen. Please be seated.
All right, good morning, everybody. I take it you had a blessed night's sleep and arrived fresh this morning for a day of study and dialogue. I'm very excited about today. We have some Hebrew scholars to share with us. We have some questions. We're going to be looking through some of the anchor texts initially. Those are the texts where there's general agreement among Adventists. Why do we agree on this? And then we're going to be moving into those texts where we diverge as Adventists. We're going to be asking, is there anything in the underlying Hebrew text, the syntax, the grammar, that would suggest a difference of interpretation in these verses? So for those of you who are watching online, if you have a question, you can send it directly to my cell phone, conradvine@gmail.com. I believe that's written up on the live stream. Thank you, Todd, for that. And yesterday there was a vigorous discussion going on online as people were watching us. And I was watching the feed up at the back there, and there was a lot of people commenting on what they were seeing and hearing. And last night I had a stream of questions coming into me, which I was trying to deal with early this morning. So people are engaged, people are watching, people are being blessed by this. And yesterday the presentations were an absolute blessing. So today we will have our morning session is 9 till noon. We're going to take a break at the top of every hour. And so there'll be 2 breaks, and we have at noon we'll have our lunch. Lunch will be provided in the family center for everybody who is here today, and then we will gather back at 1:30 when we will have another season of prayer, and then we'll go from 2 till 5, and then we'll conclude for today at 5 o'clock. So we have a group of scholars with us here today. and we'd like to invite you to come and take your seats up on the platform. We have bullseyes for your chests, and so we have, once you take your seats, we'll ask you to introduce yourselves. If you have with you the little handout, the little brochure, that will detail this little book here. If you have a particular question on a particular text, when we get to that text, then you raise your hand and we'll take your question. The way we're going to do this is we're going to ask our scholars, some questions on certain texts. And if you have a question or a comment on that, just raise your hand. I'll catch my eyes. And then when the scholars have finished discussing it, then you can add your input, your comments, your query, your question for clarification. And we recognize that we're dealing in, I'm not a Hebrew scholar. And so a lot of this, I want to make sure that everybody can understand this. So we'd ask our Hebrew scholars, please. We know there are some technicalities, whether it's the hifal or whatever we're talking about here, or the vav consecutive. That's all I remember from Hebrew. There's a vav consecutive somewhere. So that's good, yes. I don't know what it is, but I know there's a vav consecutive. So we want to make sure that the dialogue that comes out is understandable for everybody. And the skill of a great teacher, as Jesus was, the greatest of all teachers, is to make the most profound of all truths understandable to all their hearers. And that is what we want to accomplish today. So I'll just move along here to give you a bit more space. So on the little handout here, if you turn to the very middle of the booklet, you see Daniel 11 anchor and divergence texts. And then if you turn the next page, you'll see that we've already prepared this document in advance for today. You'll see that on the left-hand column we have the anchor texts. Those are texts where there's general agreement among Adventist interpreters. And on the right-hand column we have the divergence texts. And we're going to be taking first, in our first session this morning, the anchor texts, where there is general agreement, why there is general agreement. And then when we finished with the anchor text, and I hope there is general agreement about the anchor texts, then we will move on to the text where there's more divergence. And we've left the most difficult text for tomorrow afternoon, because Jesus' most important miracles were done on the Sabbaths. And we need a miracle tomorrow as we discuss those divergence texts. So maybe we can just start with Dr. Martin. Can you introduce yourselves and say where you serve? And so we have an idea who you are.
Good morning. I'm Martin Probstle. I come from Austria. Originally, I'm German. I'm teaching at the seminary there in Austria. It's called Seminarschluss Bogenhofen. And I'm glad to be here and to share with my friends and colleagues.
My name is Michael Younker, and currently I'm with the Office of Archives, Statistics, and Research at the General Conference. And I've just been there for just under a year, and I just finished my studies here at Andrews as well. Talk loud.
Good morning, Jerome Skinner. I'm a assistant professor of Old Testament theology and exegesis at the seminary. I've taught at the seminary for 4 years. This is my first year full-time.
I'm Tarsee Li. I teach at Oakwood University. I teach classes in Old Testament and Hebrew and hermeneutics.
My name is Samuel Nunes. I am a retired professor of Old Testament exegesis and theology. I come from San Antonio, Texas.
My name is Amanda McGuire-Moushon, and I am an adjunct professor at the seminary. I teach Hebrew specifically, and exegesis once in a while.
I'm Roy Gane. I'm professor of Hebrew Bible and Ancient Near Eastern Languages here at the SDA Theological Seminary, originally from Australia. So we were talking, he's from Austria now, and I'm from Australia. So they have the Alps and we have the kangaroos. Don't get us confused.
Yes. All right. So up on the screen, can we just use first names for this process? Okay. So Roy, up on the screen, can you just explain what people are seeing up on the screen?
This is the Accordance Bible software program, and I never do any serious Bible study or hardly ever read the Bible without opening Accordance, because this has so many tools in it, and I'll show you some of those along the way. It's an amazingly powerful Bible study tool. I can drag my cursor over all of these Hebrew words, and it will show me the details down at the bottom. You may be able to see down at the bottom there, it changes. And then here I have the English translation. I can pull up the Greek New Testament, the Septuagint, ancient Near Eastern inscriptions, all kinds of stuff. Dictionaries. I can click 3 times on a word like this, and here I have the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, which is one of the major lexicons. I can come down here, get another major lexicon, Dictionary of Classical Hebrew. Of course, you have to buy all of these modules, but it's an amazing tool. The exciting thing about this particular tool is, and I recommend that everybody get it, even if you don't have to be a Hebrew scholar to get this and to benefit from it. You can have the Greek and Hebrew text and English translations. You can place them next to each other, and you can see what word, you see I've put my cursor over the English word in the translation, and I can see what Hebrew word it's translating. See that? And so you can start to work in Hebrew, even if you don't really know Hebrew very well, and use those tools. But the best thing about it is I can do all kinds of searches. So I can go into the mode of Hebrew here, and I can do a search on anything I want. I can have a lexical form I can put in here, and I can just go to, for example, kippur. All right, there's one word. Whoops, I didn't type that right. Okay, I'll just type it here. And there we go. And then I just hit return, but then I can also add other things. I can make it a verb, and I can choose what kind of verb I want, and so on. I'm not going to go through the whole thing here, but you can see that I can look up specific words elsewhere that we're going to find in the text of Daniel 11 to compare them with context elsewhere. Because in exegesis, context is king. The contexts of words in their particular location are what determines the meaning, as in any language. And one of the really great things is I can not only search for individual words, I can search for combinations, word strings, one word following another, and then followed by another. So I can look for phrases, combinations, in any format you want, and that's extremely helpful. So essentially, and I'll just make this the last line, this is a browser. It's a Bible browser. Think of the web, which has an incredible amount of information, but you want to find what you want to find. So this is a way to surf the Bible. I'm from Australia, so I love the idea of surfing, and I love the Bible, so I'm very excited about it. And by the way, all of us here, some people are introverts, some are extroverts, but I think all of us here are textroverts. So we're going to have a great time. If you see us enjoying each other, then you'll know that we're getting excited about the Word.
All right, thank you very much, Roy. So let's start out with our first anchor texts. They're found in chapter 11, verses 2 and 3. And these have historically been understood by Adventist scholars as referring to after Cyrus. We have Cambyses, false Smyrnes, and Darius the first, and then the great king who was to arrive being Xerxes the Great. Why is there so, as we look through all the Adventist scholars, there's almost unanimous agreement that these are the kings that this verse refers to? Why are we so solid in this interpretation?
Well, when you read the text, you can see that the last king here that mentioned, the fourth one, if we start here in Daniel 11, verse 1, we're beginning in verse 2, actually here, with the vision itself. Or not the vision, there's no vision here. It's the interpretation, as Kim Kier pointed out yesterday. It's the third interpretation of the vision in Daniel 8. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia. A fourth shall be far richer than all of them. When he has become strong through his riches, he will stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. Now, the king who did that, we know that Darius I had some problems with Greece, and he actually got defeated by Athens. But his son, Xerxes, took it out on Greece in a massive way, and he gathered one of the largest armies in the ancient world, including many people from many different nations, which Persia controlled, and mercenaries and everything. And he launched, as we all know, a massive attack on Greece. Okay? So he was the husband of Esther. This is the Ahasuerus, Hebrew Achashverosh, Xerxes. And he was the one, historically, this really couldn't be anyone else who did this. He was defeated at the battles of Thermopylae and Marathon and ultimately Salamis, the naval battle. We know all about those. And we have our marathon race in the Olympics to commemorate that Battle of Marathon. But there is one outlier, one Adventist interpreter, who thinks that the king here is Artaxerxes I, the son of Xerxes. The reason is because following Cyrus, the kings were Cambyses, the son of Cyrus. Then there was false Smyrtus, who was a usurper. And then there was Darius I, and the fourth king was Xerxes. That's why we think that the fourth king is Xerxes. But this one Adventist interpreter wants to discount false Smyrtus because he was a usurper. And therefore, he takes it as Cambyses and Darius and Xerxes, and then the fourth being Artaxerxes I. However, Artaxerxes I didn't do what this verse says, which is to accomplish all of this. Personally, I find it remarkable that this prophecy in advance, which we believe it's in advance, is even identifying a usurper. Now, this is a level of detail that God in his wisdom is revealing, and then to characterize this so accurately ahead of time is quite remarkable.
Okay, thank you. There was a question yesterday, and we were referring back to Daniel chapter 8. And the question arose in Daniel chapter 8 and verse 8. It talks about the four horns came up towards the four winds of heaven. And then Daniel 8 and verse 9 says, out of one of them grew another horn. And the question in 11, as we look at 11 chapter 4, it talks about the four winds of heaven once again. And there was a comment made, I think it was Martin you shared yesterday, the grammar of Daniel 8 indicates, is it that the power that arises in Daniel 8, which we take to be the papacy, does it arise out of one of the four horns or one of the four winds of heaven?
Go for it, Martin. Martin wrote a dissertation on this.
Yeah, thank you. The question was if the grammar refers to that or not?
Yes.
Yeah, I believe it does not. I mean, in the past we have a kind of an ingenious explanation that the feminine and the masculine gender, right, just go over there for a moment to Daniel 8 verses 9 and 8 at the end. I do that here on my computer here. In the end, you see the four winds of heaven, and the winds is feminine. It has the feminine plural ending, and the heaven is masculine, it has a masculine plural ending. So the argument goes like this, so that you understand why I do not refer to this argument as conclusive, that in verse 9 you see from one of them, and the from one, the ha'achat, is feminine singular again, and the mehem is masculine plural. So there seems to be an alignment between ruchot and ha'achat, between winds and one, and and between the heaven, hashamayim, and mehem, the plural, them. And because of this alignment, the argument goes, it needs to refer back to the one wind, or to one of the winds of heaven. And it seems interesting, it seems convincing first, but then if you go closer into the Hebrew, you see that this doesn't work like this. The one of them in Daniel 8:9 is the usual way you would find one thing of them. The masculine plural is the default version where you go to, so it is not the feminine and the masculine is here not in alignment to Daniel 8, verse 8 at the end. There's another text, and I think that's in Chronicles, I think I have to look that up where that is. But in Chronicles, you have the similar thing that God presents David of several options he could choose. That is probably then 2 Chronicles 21, I guess. The several options of judgments he could choose because of his counting of the nation. And then he chooses one of them, and it's exactly the same Greek the Hebrew phrase, like it is in 2 Samuel 24. But in one of them, interestingly, in the Chronicles text, it uses the same masculine, feminine switch, which in the Samuel text, it's all masculine. So it seems to be that in the Hebrew, it's possible to have it either way. And with that, the argument cannot be a grammatical one at this place. But there are other good arguments that it comes from one of the winds.
All right, so as we look at that Daniel 8, your conclusion would be that the Daniel 8 and 9 says, out of one of them came another horn, that the one of them, the them refers to one of the four winds of heaven rather than the four horns of the Greek Empire.
What I just try to say is that we cannot use the argument we have used in the past 2-3 decades.
All right.
I'm still on the line that I would say it comes from one of the winds. But the arguments need to be different. Like in verse 9 it says that the horn Yatzah, it comes out of. If a horn comes from another horn, in Daniel 8, twice the verb Allah is used, to grow up from. That's what a horn does. But here it does Yatzah. That's a military term, where you go out from one place to the other to fight, to make war. So this is not like a horn is growing out of another horn. It comes out from somewhere. And where does it come out from? This is in alignment to the he-goat and the ram before. They go out from a direction and go into another direction to make war with another entity. And here the little horn, the small horn, is connected with this kind of model to go out from one direction, go against another direction. And so the Yatzah indicates that this horn goes out from a direction.
Okay.
And then you have to refer it back to the four winds. These are just two of the arguments. There are several ones.
By the way, Martin, I found that text in 1 Chronicles 21:10.
Yes.
Echad Mehena. If you look, I don't know if you can see the screen. You probably can't. It's behind you. Oh, there it is, right there.
That's all right. Yeah.
Okay. Is that the right
and
verse?
now if you compare it to 2 Samuel 24, you see there that it is both masculine.
Okay. 2 Samuel 24, we just
All
go
right,
back.
so what we're hearing you say, Brother
go.
Martin, is that the out of one of them is more of a generic phrase that is used elsewhere in the Hebrew Scriptures, and we shouldn't be making a big deal of the genders of that phrase to say that this refers to the winds, but you can make other linguistic arguments that the horn that arises in Daniel 8 is from the winds.
I think the better one is the literary argument, the model which we have, going out from a direction, coming out from a direction, go somewhere else. The Yatzah here, the little horn aligned to the ram and the he-goat, but we should not use this itchy-bitchy grammatical so-called argument. Yeah.
Okay.
Could I ask a question here that's exactly related to that Yatzah?
Go ahead.
In the Daniel and Revelation Committee Series volume that discusses this, I think it's the Daniel volume number 2, it talks about this being a horizontal expansion, which would be of imperial Rome, first Republican Rome and then merging into imperial Rome, and then a vertical expansion from verses 10 to 12 of the papacy going in a religious direction. Would you agree with that? That we have pagan Rome in verse 9 moving towards the south, that would be the Punic Wars, Carthage, the east against Antiochus III, and then against the glorious land, which is the land of Israel, Pompey the Great, in perfect order, as William Shea says. What would you agree?
Well, Roy has been on my defense committee, so he probably knows if I agree or not. But
it's been
actually,
a
while. I do not agree.
Was it a rhetorical question or a loaded grenade?
No, it's not a loaded grenade. Personally, I think that in Daniel 8, you do not see much of pagan Rome. I think Shea made this argument with the horizontal and the vertical. Yeah, I can understand why he's doing this. Hazel, by the way, he saw the difference later on. He says pagan Rome is verse 9 and verse 10. And in verse 11, because the switch of the feminine horn to the masculine horn, in verse 11 you have masculine for the subject, that would indicate a switch from pagan to papal. No, I'm not sure if there is a switch, and just because the main reason for that is that the little horn in chapter 8 is the same Hebrew phrase for the Aramaic small horn in chapter 7. And I would rather go with the way that one symbol, which is exactly phrased in the same way, is the same, stands for the same interpretation as the symbol in the other chapter. So in Daniel 7, we would all agree that the little horn is not pagan Rome. In chapter 7, we would say it's papal Rome. In chapter 8, I would say the same. It's papal Rome. Pagan Rome is not in view here. The horn is always on a religious, political level and not just on a simple political level. Which in the end, it says here, it goes until the El Hatzevi, against the beautiful. Most translations have here the beautiful land, right? And they insert the land coming back from Daniel 11, where we started off right now. There you have the beautiful land, the Eretz Hatzevi. But here it's just the Hatzevi. And Hatzevi, the beautiful, comes in the Old Testament from the idea that the land or the mountain, there's also a beautiful mountain. It's also in Daniel 11. Beautiful, it is not because it has a nice scenery, blue sky, luscious palm trees, and so on. Beautiful it is because the Lord is there. And if the Lord is there, then it makes it beautiful. So here it goes against the beauty, and that means it goes against what the Lord is present there. Could be the temple, because the temple makes the land beautiful and the mountain beautiful. So I see in Daniel 8:9 already the intention to go against the temple of God.
Tarsee, I think.
All right, Brother Tarsee.
I just wanted to add to it. Thank you, Martin, for the explanation. Okay, is it close enough? Yeah, I guess you can hear me now. Yeah, I'm not too sure about the little horn not arising out of one of the other horns, actually. I don't think we can rule that out as an interpretation. But just to add to the gender switches, you have in verse 9, after that expression from one of them, you have the next verb, the verb you quoted, yatsa, to come out in the masculine. So the horn comes out, that's masculine. And then in the next sentence, you have a feminine for it, and it will grow, vatigdal. So the same horn has a verb that's masculine, followed by a verb that's feminine. And then if you move on to verse 11, you have the masculine form of that verb, higdil. So the horn is masculine once, feminine another time, and so these genders, you cannot build conclusions based on the genders in Daniel 8.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Pastor Kelly.
Yeah, I have a question relative to the absence of pagan Rome in the imagery. And my question is this: is it reasonable, since the Roman representation is the longest and a persecuting power is its distinction against the saints, is it reasonable to suggest that since the pagan phase persecuted Christ and the religio-political phase persecuted his people, that rather than actually having to find pagan Rome in the passage, we just see the little horn representing the main emphasis of what Rome was to the people of God?
Okay. You made the comment on you don't see papal pagan. I've always understood that the fourth beast of Daniel 7 to be starting off as pagan Rome, and then the little horn that comes up to be the papal manifestation, but they're both persecuting powers.
Yeah, so my real question is, since the papal phase lasts much longer than the pagan phase, and it's clearly seeking to wipe out God's church, but the pagan phase was also seeking to destroy our salvation, our hope in Christ, is it possible that is it unfair to simply say this one symbol represents the entire thing, and we don't have to absolutely find in the text pagan Rome?
This is an excellent question. Of course, this is a Daniel 11 conference, not a Daniel 8 conference. But the reason why we have to deal with this is because we have to view Daniel 8 and Daniel 9, the previous prophecies, as the framework within which we look for anchor points and places of correspondence, because we have a pretty good idea of what Daniel 8 means. So if we find similar language and ideas in Daniel 11, we know where we are in relation to Daniel 8. And so that's why this is so important. There's another factor here to sort of amplify your question, and that is on the basis of the idea that because the horn symbol is the same as in Daniel 7, and therefore it should mean exactly the same thing as in Daniel 7, that is the papacy. On that basis, there is a prominent Adventist interpreter who has said that after the division of the four kingdoms in Daniel 11, I'm looking at the anchored divergence text chart here, after that division into the four kingdoms, Daniel 11 must move directly to the papacy and skip pagan Rome altogether, because that's what Daniel 8 does, according to that interpreter. Okay, so in other words, if you go directly from the four conspicuous horns, which is the four Hellenistic empires, divisions of Alexander's empire, then if Daniel 8 verse 9 moves directly to the papacy, Daniel 11, which is a commentary on Daniel 8, should do exactly the same thing. It should move directly from the division into four kingdoms, and here we go in Daniel 11, directly, see we have it in verse 4, and then verse 5 and following, all the way to verse 39 or so, is got to be the papacy. Now, so that's something we have to throw into the mix in terms of an issue. Yeah.
I would like to say that the explanation of Gabriel concerning the little horn, it says that the little horn would arise at the end of the four kingdoms. Mm-hmm. That says to me that the little horn is representing the whole, is a synecdoche, a part representing the whole thing. It would start at the end of the four kingdoms, and it finishes when Michael destroys the horn from beginning to end.
So that would logically include both pagan and papal Rome.
Right.
Yes.
Rome in three stages. The first stage, pagan Rome. Mm-hmm. The second stage, Papal Rome during the Middle Ages, and the third stage, Papal Rome during the time of the end.
Okay, thank you. So I think that answers your question, Pastor Kelly.
Well, I can understand these argumentations, but in Daniel 8:23, you could read the text like this: "And after the end of their kingdom." Here in the translations is "at the end of the kingdom." Of course, the translations, they have their own bias. They want to see Antiochus Epiphanes here. And so they have to say at the end of their reign, because Antiochus was still part of one of the Greek kingdoms. right? But if you translate after, in the end, here actually it's the in, but I have found other places where it could mean when it is ended, their kingdom, then when the transgressors have run their course, mean when they will get full and fuller, then stands up a king. So I think that king could easily be also papacy at that time. For the one, Roy, you said there's one person in Daniel 11 who jumps from verse 4 already to the papal phase.
Yeah, so in other words,
he is not arguing that from Daniel 8, as I understand him.
I have seen that person in a lecture.
Because I thought
lecture,
in Daniel 8 he sees still pagan Rome there, at least in verse 9.
Well, this is a more recent interpretation of this person, and I've heard them on that in a public video presentation.
Oh, glad I made some impact then.
It's a new twist. There was a previous argument that then didn't work out grammatically, and it's being criticized, including by me. But then this is another attempt to put Daniel 8 then really to impose that structure on Daniel 11. Personally, I'm seeing the idea that at the latter end of their rule, yes, what did happen historically is not a gap. There wasn't a gap in history, and we're not seeing that kind of gap elsewhere. In Daniel, a symbol like a horn symbol is just a symbol. It can mean different things in different places. So obviously you have that differentiation in Daniel 8. In the vision, you have this Daniel 7, you've got this big, huge T-Rex monster, and then the horn is separate from it clearly. But then here we just have a horn. And I don't think we have to necessarily say that it's exactly the same parameters, that is, boundaries, as the horn in Daniel 7. Obviously, there's some relationship because it's a symbol, and symbols can mean different things different times. What I'm seeing in Daniel 8 and in Daniel 11 is, whereas Daniel 7 has showed us a distinction, an articulation between them, Daniel 8 and Daniel 11 are showing us continuity between them, which is historically true, because the papacy grew out of pagan Rome and continued that. So it's a different emphasis. And what I'm seeing in Daniel 8 verse 9 is, as Shea pointed out, and I agree with him, that the growth of Rome was horizontally, as you pointed out, Yetzirah is horizontal, and it grew toward the south. It conquered Carthage. Toward the east, it conquered the Seleucid. Well, at least it attacked and subordinated Antiochus the Great. And then Pompey the Great went toward the glorious land. So all the directions are right, and this is clearly identifying a power from the northwest. Whereas earlier we had the ram coming from the east, and then we had the goat coming from the west. Here, clearly it's a power from the northeast. These are the directions it went. I think it would be hard-pressed to say that the papacy expanded specifically in those directions when it started off. And here we seem to be dealing with a military expansion as in the previous verses.
Well, let me ask the question. If it would be the papacy, how would you argue it?
Mm-hmm. Well,
to the history guys.
Maybe the most obvious answer to this conundrum is to go to the next anchor text, which is actually, we interpret the death of Christ in verse 22 of chapter 11. Because if Christ dies in chapter 11 and verse 22 under pagan Rome, it's very hard to make the case that from verse 4 through 21 we're dealing with papal Rome, that the text doesn't jump back and forth between the phases of Rome. So I'd like to come to verse 22 right now to remind ourselves. It says, "Armies shall be utterly swept away and broken before him." That's, we interpret as referring to Tiberius Caesar, and the prince of the covenant as well. Now, this phrase, the prince, occurs a few times in the book of Daniel. It appears in Daniel chapter 8 and Daniel chapter 9, and it also appears in Daniel chapter 11. Why are we so certain that this prince of the covenant really is Jesus Christ here in this verse here?
Before we go to that, I just don't want to move so quick. I want to deal with this issue of divided toward the four winds of heaven to get a sense of the relationship that we're talking about, continuity in history. If you track the relationship between the north and the south and you see the verbs that are used, the same verbs are used throughout the whole chapter to talk about the aggression, to talk about the violence, to talk about the persecution. So I think we're trying to make these distinctions in our mind because we're looking back at history. But if you just take 11 on its own merits, it doesn't make those distinctions. It just talks about this back and forth between the North and the South with the same verbs. So I fear sometimes we're trying to make the text make these little crucial distinctions that I'm not sure if you read the text just in terms of the battle between the North and the South that Daniel was trying to make. So there's two issues when you're dealing with interpretation. One is, what did Daniel hear? And then two is, from our perspective looking back, how do we interpret it? And I think we're saying our interpretation is exactly what Daniel saw in terms of history. I'm not sure that what he saw and what we're interpreting are exactly the same thing. I think we're looking back at history and saying, oh, he saw this. No, he saw the North and the South. He saw this aggression. He's not making those little historical distinctions. So how should we understand the nature of the conflict when we come to the king of the North, to the king of the South? I think you have to track the verbal activity throughout the whole chapter before we even start talking about interpreting in terms of applying any type of historical framework that Daniel saw. So what do we see? We see when it says, and it was divided toward the four winds. Where does that term first occur? It occurs in 7:7 when it talks about the four winds of heaven were stirred up upon the great sea. We understand that to be some type of aggression, some type of conflict. Okay, so we already know that this is the concern. We see this historical concern of conflict. The little details about history is something that we're looking at. I first want us to hear what Daniel is saying in terms of why does he say they were divided toward the four winds of heaven? Is he referring back to 7:7 to get our minds thinking about conflict, not necessarily the specific little details first? So that's just, I want us to keep conscious of that throughout, that we're not just superimposing what we saw happen in history on what Daniel is trying to get us to understand.
Could it possibly be that the continuity between the phrase, the four winds of heaven, in 11, we're being drawn back to what happened in Daniel 7, that these are the same events are being described? Is that a possibility?
It's possible. I think there is this sense that there's a linear progression in history. That all these kingdoms, like chapter 2 says, it's a historical progression, kingdom after kingdom. They're using the same methodologies. They're using the same type of activity, but then the stone will come. So whether you can parallel, exactly each, grammatical issue or syntactical issue between chapters, that remains to be seen. But at least if we're going to read the whole book and hear what Daniel heard first, I want us to think in terms of what is Daniel telling us? What is the angel telling Daniel is going to happen? And then when we look back in history, we can have an idea of these types of conflicts that are occurring.
Okay.
This is very well taken. And another passage that would be relevant there, that's maybe even closer than Daniel 7, would be Zechariah. Now, Zechariah is written perhaps later. It's right. It's post-exilic, Zechariah?
Yeah.
Okay. So Zechariah 6:5, though, is using the same expression. These are going out to the four winds of heaven. It's talking about these horses. And then the chariot with the black horses goes toward the north country. The dapple ones go toward the south country. So here, the four winds are representing the four directions of the compass. So that's very helpful. In other words, the little horn there, so-called little horn, it's the horn from littleness, right? It starts off little, but then it becomes the Arnold Schwarzenegger horn, right? Big burly horn. Okay, but it comes from one of the directions, right? Toward which, that is the winds, which is just directions, and to which the Empire of Alexander split.
I think to the question, I think we have to go to the terms used there in Daniel 11:22. You have Nagid and you have Berit. And they're in a construct relationship, I guess, right, Rory? Can you see that for the people?
Okay, we've got 1122 up here. Is that what you're looking at?
Yes, 22, the last two words.
The last two words is nagid brit. Very good. Okay, right there, in construct, which means, construct means two nouns next to each other, or words used as nouns, that are in a genitival relationship between them. So it's one of the other, and that of simply puts those words in a relationship, which can mean many different things, depending upon the context. So here it's nagid brit, the prince. Notice it's translated of the covenant. What does that mean? Yeah.
It's a relationship between the nagid and the covenant. They belong together in some way or form. And when you look now where nagid is used in Daniel, probably you will go back to Daniel chapter 9, verse 26, for example. There nagid is used. And the berit, of course, is used several times here in Daniel 11. You have it in Daniel 11:28. There it is used with the adjective holy, holy covenant. Same in Daniel 11, verse 30, holy covenant. Of course, it is also used in Daniel 11:32, just covenant there. And the holy covenant, it seems for us, is a covenant related to God. Something is holy because God made it holy. So it would be the divine covenant in verse 30 and 28. If the nagid is related to covenant, the question would be, to which covenant would it be related? Is it the divine covenant in 30 and 28, or 28 and 30, or is it the covenant in 32, which could refer to just any covenant you do between two major powers? But here it just appears like this. It has no article, nothing. It's not the nagid of the covenant. It's just covenant nagid, covenant prince. And so Adventist scholars agree, except for one, I know, which makes it not an anchor point all agree on, but there is one who does say it's not the Holy Covenant, but they agree it's the covenant. And the nagid is the prince, prince of the covenant. Who is that? And then you say it's Jesus Christ, because who else would be a prince of a covenant? It might not be a high priest. High priest is not called the prince of the covenant. Never anywhere, I guess. You might disagree if you know of any point where he is.
So you're disagreeing with the preterist interpretation. Preterist means that everything is fulfilled in the past. So the little horn is all back in the past, in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. And according to that view, they take Onias III, the high priest in those days, as the prince of the covenant. But what you're saying is that doesn't work because that language never applies to a high priest.
Yes. And it locates it, of course, then in the first century, in the power of pagan Rome. Let me say just one more word. If pagan Rome is not in Daniel 8, it is not a reason why it's not in Daniel 11. It's the same thing like, I hear people argue it's in Daniel 7, so it must be in Daniel 8. Why?
Yeah, right.
I mean, Babylon is not there too. The reason is obvious, because Babylon has almost come to an end. But we're in the reign of King Belshazzar. But still, it's not there. So do we need to find it? No. So why is it so important to find pagan Rome in Daniel 8 if it has not a consequence for Daniel 11 or for the interpretation of Daniel 7? I think to put pagan Rome in might be a reflection of thinking back to methodology. We need to find history for these interpretations here, for these symbolic things, symbolic in Daniel 7 and 8. And we argue from history sometimes, and I think we should start from the text, as we have said yesterday.
Yes, I agree.
And if the text would not allow it, I don't need to see it there.
All right, Brother Tarsee, and then we have Brother Greg back here.
There's a lot more detail in Daniel 11 than Daniel 8. But that seems to be a pattern in the book of Daniel. And, chapter 8 gives us some more information. Well, chapter 7 gives us some more information than chapter 2. And I think chapter 8 gives us more information than chapter 7. And I think there's some value in seeing the little horn in chapter 8 as coming out of one of the horns rather than one of the winds. Because just as you have a blurring of the third and fourth kingdoms when you come to chapter 8, there is also the blurring continuing in chapter 11, where the king of the north can be both a Greek entity and a Roman entity. So I see a progression taking place in the book of Daniel.
Okay, thank you, Brother Greg. And then we have a comment at the front here.
Yeah, I appreciate this. Some of the key words, such as Prince, Nagid of the covenant, being explained. This is very helpful.
Can you put the microphone up to your mouth, Greg?
Nagid. I appreciate the Prince idea of Nagid and being. My question is in Daniel 9:26 about the ruler who will come. The other ruler in Daniel 9:26. What is the Hebrew there? 9:26. The ruler who will come. Is that also Nagid?
Yes, that's also Nagid.
And this is where many people get confused, particularly our dispensationalist brothers take this text and they make it into something else instead of historical. And so that key word right there is also a negative power, an antichrist, if you will. And I think it was probably Titus at the time, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Just so you know, on that issue, there are some Adventists that say the Nagid who comes, some say it refers to Rome, and some say it refers to the Jewish people. So even among Adventist scholars, it's not like there's complete continuity on how to interpret that. If you read Bill Shea's commentary, I believe he points out that there are those two positions among Adventist scholars, just for your point of reference.
Okay, but I think the point is well made that the Nagid of Daniel 9:26, the troops of the prince who is to come, as my version translates it, we should not assume that this Nagid is Jesus Christ. This is another power, either Titus and coming to Rome, or maybe the Jews around the time of the fall of Rome, but it isn't Jesus Christ. We have a question from the front here. Can you give your name, brother?
Yeah, Terry Nelson. And my question is referred back to my brother here. When you made this statement that horns are always religious, political, and yet when we look at the ram in Daniel 2, those two horns are not religious, they're just political. When we look at the horn in the he-goat, that's just political. That's Alexander the Great. And it just makes sense to me, and I'm wanting feedback, I guess. My question is, if Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 and Daniel 8 and Daniel 11 are repeated enlargement, it doesn't make sense to me that there would be a leaving out in Daniel 8 of pagan Rome. Because you have it in 2, and you can't, at least in my thinking at least, you can't just say, well, Babylon wasn't part of it, so you don't have to have pagan Rome, because as you said, Babylon was about to be done, and so it's looking at the future. But one of the major persecutors of God's church was pagan Rome. And so I just don't see that we leave that out of there and try to blend that with papal Rome. So I guess I'm asking you, how is it that you say that the horns are always religious political when we see evidence that that's not always the case?
Maybe that depends on my German. I'm not sure if I said that. What I meant is that the horn, the one horn, the small horn, is religious political, very clearly from Daniel 7. I do not mean that any horns are. I mean, you have, outside of Daniel, you have horns, and they just refer to power, of course. But in Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, the horn from smallness, that is religious political power. It's different than the other ones. Now, I can live with the pagan Rome phase there. I have written in the Interpreting Scripture, which Gerd Pfandl edited for the BRI, and there I give two versions, and I give the reasons for the one and the reasons for the other, so I can live with it, okay? But I just want you to understand that we come from an interpretative point of view to see pagan Rome in there. We do not work with the text. The only thing for the text speaking for pagan Rome is that you see something like a masculine, feminine gender change, or maybe horizontal, vertical, but who says that this identifies a different face? I don't know. Let me put it this way, and then I close with Daniel 8, because we're here for Daniel 11, yes. Right? It seems like I'm on the defense here. My defense committee asked probably the same question. But let me put it this way. In Daniel 7, the most interesting thing in Daniel 7 for Daniel is the little horn. Do you agree? Mm-hmm. Because that's when he comes to the interpretation. He asks questions about the little horn, about the four and the little horn specifically. And the explanation in Daniel 7 starts focusing on the little horn. As Tarsee explained, it's kind of a more detailed here. You get the look through the magnifying glass on the horn. Now, it seems to me that would continue this kind of narrative in Daniel 8. You just use the he-goat and the ram and the he-goat as a backdrop. But the real player in Daniel 8 is the little horn. Mm-hmm. Even in the interpretation, the angel just mentions in one clause the ram, in one clause the he-goat, and then he comes to the king and explains a lot about the king. So Daniel 8 is not about Greece and Medo-Persia before. It is about the little horn. So why not skip the player in between to say, okay, just focus now on the little horn. Do not focus on Rome, pagan faith. Also, we are talking here about a religious war, a cultic war. And all the language from chapter 8, from verse 9 on, in my view, is indicating, hey, cult. And now I have a hard time to see that this is referring in any way to pagan Rome. Pagan Rome has nothing to do with cult. Yes, they persecuted the Christian church in the fact they made the order to crucify Christ, yes, but they were not interested in offering a different cult to the cult of God, I guess.
All right. We have a question from the back here.
Yeah, and I just, before Brandon asks this question, I do want to affirm the time we've spent thus far on this, though, because our hermeneutic has been enlarge and expand. So this is a foundation for where we're going. We can go ahead and get ready to move. We do have one more question on this topic. So it is very appropriate and apropos to what we're talking about, and we do appreciate the time you've spent on it. Thank you.
Okay.
I hope I haven't been completely cut off by Martin by saying we're not going to discuss it. I think there's something else in the text in Daniel 8 that it's not just the vertical, horizontal, and the gender variances there, but there's the triple gadal, which is magnifying, and the idea is that, you know, this word gadal is found in chapter 11 as well. He magnifies himself above every god in verse 30, somewhere around 36 to 39. So it's not just the little horn that acts in this gadal way. It's the ram and the he-goat, and it would indicate that they're all religious. And I think someone mentioned this. They all have a political and religious aspect. They all magnify themselves in some way, and the emperor cult in Rome was one of these ways of the magnifying of the emperor to the position of a god. But that didn't start there. The Greeks did it. Alexander the Great was declared a god, and so was Cyrus and many of the other Persian Achaemenid emperors. So there is a continual magnifying, this word gadal, which is also used to magnify against the prince. So I think there's that aspect. And just on the aspect of the little horn having to be the same in chapter 8 as it is in chapter 7, there are different perspectives each chapter brings. And in chapter 7, they all come out of water, whereas in chapter 8, they're coming from different directional, horizontal directions, not out of water, not out of the same vantage point. And also what Tarsee was saying regarding there's a sense of blurring. It made me think of the fact that in chapter 7, it's got teeth like iron, just like the legs, but it also has claws like bronze, just like the waist of bronze. So there does seem to be, each chapter doesn't correlate exactly. So just because it's called the horn from littleness in chapter 7 and 8, doesn't mean that it's exactly the same perspective on that horn from littleness. It could have multiple phases, especially with the multiple uses of...
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, Brother Brendan. There was, for my pains, I did Latin at school till I was 18. I had to read a lot of Latin poetry. And in the first century, many of the Roman writers bemoaned the fact that while they had conquered Greece militarily, Greece had conquered Rome culturally. And they recognized that there was a dynamic interplay. Rome conquered militarily, but the Roman writers themselves, like Catullus, the poet, recognized that Greece had conquered Rome culturally. We'll take a comment from over here, and then we'll take our first break. Yes.
I believe that in order to understand chapter 8, we must take into account Daniel's concern. We see in the book of Daniel that Daniel is concerned about God, is concerned about the temple of Jerusalem, is concerned about Jerusalem, is concerned about Israel, the covenant people. In chapter 2 and in chapter 7, Rome doesn't anything against the Jews, the covenant people. It is in chapter 8 that we see that Rome destroys the temple. Rome's broken the Messiah, pagan Rome. Rome desolates Jerusalem and almost destroy the people of God. It's pagan Rome. It is not papal Rome.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. Joe, a short
Maybe I'll
comment,
just have
Roy?
a PS on that. What you're saying is Daniel 9 is the explanation of the vision of Daniel 8.
Yes.
And there you have pagan Rome playing an important place.
Yes.
Which
Daniel 9 explains Daniel 8, and Daniel 11 also explains Daniel 8.
All right, it's kind of reality. If we lived in the 2nd century AD, we would be focusing on the pagan aspect of Rome, not knowing that there would be a papal aspect. Because of our vantage point in history, we see pagan imperial, a republican imperial, and then a papal Rome. And so we have much more nuance to this understanding. And maybe we are making distinctions that a 2nd century reader, AD, of this passage would not have had any idea about papal Rome to come. All they know is there is bad news coming down the track. But we can look backward from history and make those distinctions. This is the question you said of what did Daniel hear and what do we read? Well, we have that vantage point.
I have not a good feeling about that, because if I go a few centuries earlier, they would see Antiochus Epiphanes.
I'm not aware of any Christians writing in the 2nd century that was Antiochus Epiphanes.
Take the Septuagint. The Septuagint is, for me, a biased translation in Daniel 8. And I think, if you see, it has a few additions there. I think some could argue that it refers to Antiochus Epiphanes.
Well, some could argue, but I would say they're not correct, Brother Martin.
Look it up for yourself, Conrad.
Yes. All right, we will take a 10-minute break now. We'll gather back and begin again at 10:10. Thank you. you have a question? Okay, when we start.
I never heard.
Even on when something basic, you would think that's basic.
That's why when I identify it, if you include all the things stuff,
yeah,
we'll probably have more agreement with people.
Right.
What about so how do people do that?
No, it did go to
well, wait, which way is it? South or north?
Yeah. No, south and east.
Okay, well, but, you know, I mean, the three horns represent
But the he went to the Oscar. But he didn't do the other one. If it's the Garula, it was the guy before him. And if it's closer, who took out this guy, his thumb, see that now is a better that was also
All right, if we could ask everybody to gather back together, we shall continue with our discussion. And we'll take a final comment on the Nagid Berith. If we can please take your seats, and we will get underway. We have a lot of distance to cover, and we haven't even got to the text where there's disagreement. So we're still on the areas of agreement, and I would say this: if you're a married couple and this is your area of agreement, then you need to have marriage counseling immediately. So welcome back, everybody. And Todd, are we live again? Okay, thank you. Welcome back to our viewers around the world. We're delighted you can be with us. And as we begin our next session, let's just bow our heads again and ask for the leading of God's Spirit. So shall we pray? Heavenly Father, we claim again the promise of your Holy Spirit. Father, when Daniel prayed, you sent an angel to give understanding. And Father, we're asking you to do the same for us this morning. In Jesus' name we humbly ask. Amen. Before we move on from this question of the Prince of the Covenant, we have a comment from Brother Engel Yoda. And Brother Engel, he has the black microphone, Todd. If you want to... Does your microphone work there?
Okay.
Can you speak up for us, please?
Yes. Thank you for taking one more question. Regarding verse 22, you have it there in anchor text, and I question whether it should be an anchor text. Not because the Prince of the Covenant is not Christ, but the timing of this text. And I think the key is in the word broken. Does that mean putting to death? I raise this because Edwin Thiel, in his syllabus that he used to teach, I think at PUC, outlines on Daniel, and also Maxwell, in his book God Cares, put this verse in the Middle Ages and they put the previous verse as the introduction of papal Rome as the vile person or the contemptible person. And if that's the case, well, then what follows is in the time of papal Rome. And they interpret broken not meaning putting to death, but to be broken figuratively is to be brokenhearted. And the word broken is shabar, and it means broken. It does not mean to be put to death, and of the 149 times it's never used to be put to death or to die. In fact, there's one definition that means to bring to birth, and it's used that way, to bring to birth, I think in Isaiah, only on one occasion, but that's just the opposite of being put to death. And so I don't, and both Maxwell and Thiel have passed away, unfortunately, but Carlos Mora agrees with that the vile person is the introduction of papal Rome in verse 21.
All right.
I don't know what he says about verse 22, but that was in a paper presented in Rome last year. And so I just want to put that to the panel if anyone has a comment.
All right, thank you. That's an excellent question, Brother Engel. Roy?
Dictionary of Classical Hebrew on the nifal, which is the form that appears in Daniel 11:22. Nifal is the passive form. And here is the Dictionary of Classical Hebrew, and their entry showing one of the various meanings of this verb in the nifal, which is the passive, okay? And this is very nice because since I did the search from that verse, it pulls up in red and shows me exactly where our reference is. Okay, so here it can mean broken, can mean be injured, be crushed, be destroyed, of people, Babylon. And I'm showing, I don't know if you can see, but down in the little window down at the bottom, it's kind of small text. I've been trying to make it bigger. It's showing, okay, it's hypertext, so I just click on that. Here's one instance. Oh, there, now I can make it bigger. That's good. Suddenly Babylon has fallen and been broken. I can verify that that is speaking of the same Hebrew word by putting that up. And now here we have Tisha B'Av, same word. Babylon has been destroyed, has fallen, and has been broken. So that means the end of Babylon, right? And then we have the Kushites. Here's another one. And all of these people, the Ethiopians, none of them remained alive, for they were broken before the Lord and his army. Okay, so they fell, and they didn't la'ain, for none of them michie, to be alive, because they were broken. So this is speaking about the death of Christ in Daniel 11:22. Oh. Yeah. Yes, about Alexander the Great being broken. Yeah, very good. Okay, that's the same word, and he died, and there it is in verse 4. As soon as he is arisen, his kingdom shall be broken. All right, in this case it means broken up, right? Well, tehatz, let's see, shall be broken and divided. Tisha B'Av, there it is. So Alexander the Great's kingdom didn't come to an end, so to speak. It came to an end as it was, in that form, as a united kingdom, and then it was broken. So you have to look at the context of what it means.
I just want to come to the subject of this nifal. The beginning of verse 22 says, Zeruot. Roy, could you go back to the nifal of Shabar? When you look in Halot, the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, when that word is used with the nifal of the verb, it does talk about destruction. The references are in Jeremiah 48:25. It says, the horn of Moab is cut off, and his arm, same word, is broken. Okay, so cut off parallels broken. Ezekiel 30:22, therefore thus says the Lord God, behold, I am against Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and I will break his arms. Both the strong arm and the one that is broken, I will make the sword fall from his hand. So he's talking about the decimation of Egypt, and we know that that happened historically by Babylon. So you have to look at what is the antecedent of this third masculine plural verb. And the verb before that comes from shataf. That also is nifal, imperfect third masculine plural. So the zeraot, you have to look at these verbs and their stem and their conjugation with the object and see, does it occur when it means to be eradicated or to be broken off or to be killed? You just can't look up a verb by itself. You have to look at the words that occur with it, and then we can draw conclusions after we do a grammatical and syntactical analysis. Okay?
That's an excellent response, Martin.
And to further, it is a word used already in Daniel 8 4 times, and it is used there specifically for the end of a power or a kingdom. So I think Daniel 11 is using that word, basically flagging the flag here. Hello, again, think back about Daniel 8. It's gone. It's death. So Daniel 11:22 speaks about the death of the Prince of the Covenant.
Okay, thank you.
It is interesting to note that in verse 22, the word zeroot, that literally means arms, in the context is translated as armies. Also, the verb shataf, that literally means to inundate, is translated as wipe away or destroy. It is a figure of language. In the third clause, where it says, and even the prince of the covenant, is an incomplete clause, and there it doesn't appear the word shataf. But in the context, and because uses the adverb gam also, besides the armies that would be destroyed, also the king of the covenant would be destroyed.
Okay, thank you. So we're hearing a variety of linguistic and syntactical and vocabulary-related reasons why this is the death of the Prince of the Covenant. We have a question here, and then we have a gentleman at the back, Felipe.
If I may just go back for a moment to Daniel 7, where we were talking about the little horn. And I appreciate the fact that we must begin with the text and then try to interpret that text. And also, I would say that we should look at the foundational beginnings of where we are coming from. Now, I'm reading verse 24 in Daniel 7. The 10 horns are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the first ones, and shall subdue 3 kings. Now, the traditional Adventist understanding of this has been that it refers to the 10 Germanic barbarian tribes. Now, in history, that has not happened. This verse 24, that this horn that will arise after subduing 3, has not happened in history, even though we say that it refers to 10 Germanic barbarian tribes. Well, first of all, there were not 10. There were probably many more than 10. And then the papacy never destroyed 3 out of those 10, out of the 10 tribes. So what do we conclude from that? It has to be futuristic. If it hasn't happened in history, it has to happen at some point in time in the future.
Thank you, brother. You're opening up a whole nother area of discussion and interpretation that's not really related to Daniel 11.
Right.
So I expect you've asked the question, but if we don't focus on where we are in Daniel 11, we could spend the rest of the day...
Daniel 11 should be understood and interpreted.
But we will spend the rest of the day arguing were the Alemanni and the Angles and the Saxons and the Heruli and the Vandals and the Huns, how many of them were there, and when were they, and who were they, and we'll never get to the bottom of that particular rabbit hole today, though I respect the question you asked. Brother Felipe at the back, and then Pastor here from Montrose, where there is a lot of snow, I understand.
Still in regards to 1122, I agree, and in the other moment that I spoke, that Daniel 11 does compound several verbs and expressions of several prophecies outside of it, especially relating to powers that attacked the people of God in different moments of Israel's history. We have a specific usage of shataf and avar that appears all over Daniel 11. So you see, like in Daniel 11:10, overflow and pass through, which shall keep coming and overthrow and pass through. We have at the end in verse 40 again, biachartzot veshataf ve'avar. So the countries and shall overflow and pass through. And there's a repetition, at least, of one of those verbs, shataf, in 2 different occasions. So you have in verse 26, his army shall be swept away. And you have in verse 22, which is the verse we were talking about, armies shall be utterly swept away. This combination of verbs only occur outside of Daniel in Isaiah 11. And it's pretty interesting to see that there you see, Isaiah 8. There it's, the prophecy is talking about Assyria and how Assyria goes over the country of Judah and overflows it as a great river and pass through the country, destroying everything. And in verse 8, you have the specific same combination of words that you find in Daniel 11. And it will sweep unto Judah, the great river of Assyria. It will overflow and pass on, reaching even to the neck, and its outspread wings will fill the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel. It's talking about the Messiah, so about Emmanuel, the overflow of that land through the same combination of verbs. And that's even, I think, when you keep looking into the language of the verse 22, the use of Nagid, that covenant, that only appeared within Daniel in Daniel 9 and in Daniel 11. So it's a sequence of words that combine the language of Daniel 11 and combine the language of a prophecy dealing with the invasion of a nation within Judah and quoting specifically the Messiah. So this use of language, it's just a comment on what you were saying. I think it supports the idea that this is the death of the Prince of the Covenant. This deals with Christ.
Okay, thank you. Brother Michael and Pastor here, can you raise your hands again for Pastor Kelly? Okay, thank you. Michael?
Just a quick comment, because I think it is relevant for determining who the Nagib and Barit are referring to, the Prince of the Covenant in Daniel 11:22. There is actually one other occasion, and that's in Isaiah 55, where Nagib and Barit are associated, at least with many interpreters, because this is seen as a messianic prophecy here in Isaiah 55. But you actually have there in verse 3 and 4, incline your ear, come to me, your soul shall live. I will make an everlasting covenant with you, even the sure mercies through David. Behold, I have given him for a witness to the people, a leader, a prince, and commander to the people. This is, again, typically understood as messianic, and so at least you have one other connection where Nagib and Barit are very likely referring to Christ. So,
okay. Thank you very much. It's just interesting to me as we have this dialogue together that we find bit by bit all the bits of evidence that lead to the conclusion that this verse is talking about the death of the Messiah. And it's been fascinating so far. Pastor, you have a comment to share with us? And give us your name first.
Fritz Krieger.
Okay.
If it's talking about the death of Christ, then the vile person has to be Tiberius, who doesn't seem that worthy of mention to me. The vile person is the antecedent of all the he's and the hymns to the end of that chapter. And so that couldn't be Tiberius. And Maxwell and some others link the vile person to the papacy, back to Daniel 8, I think, 8 and 9 in there. And the question I have for the panel is, normally apparently it refers to death, but could it be, could that, the meaning of that word also have a little bit, another application? Because the identification of the vile person is pretty crucial to the rest of this chapter.
That's right. It's not one of the anchor texts, though. We'll get to that later when we deal with those level of detail. I think one thing that we need to do, by the way, is let's look back at our anchor texts list. And we have established, I think, pretty much general agreement that Xerxes is that fourth king. Generally, in verse 3, in comparison with Daniel chapter 8, where the great king is explicitly mentioned as a king of Greece in Daniel 8, verse 21, this mighty king here who arises after that fourth king, which is Xerxes, is Alexander the Great. Now you notice that there's a major gap there, here in the text. And that's going to become a very important pattern, that Xerxes goes against Greece, And then that's the end we hear of the Persians, even though there were a whole series of more Persian emperors, kings. And then, so he goes against Greece, he loses against Greece, and then the next verse we hear about what happens with Greece. So mighty king is Alexander. And I think everybody, I don't think we even have to discuss this, do we? It's Alexander the Great. Then we have the division of the 4 kingdoms, and this is just like we were talking about in Daniel chapter 8.
May I say something in verse 4 before?
Yeah, sure, please.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting that as someone remarked here, the word shavar, to break, is used here. And I think that's an echo of chapter 8, since this is a commentary on chapter 8, because there you have, in chapter 8, verse 8, the fact that the great horn is broken. So it's the same expression there. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry, that was an interruption.
No, that's all right. That's good. So, in other words, that's relating directly to the event in 8:8. Would have to agree on that, right? This is intra. It's not intertextuality. It's intra, within the text of the book of Daniel itself. Okay? So Daniel is interpreting Daniel. The first place you look in exegesis is always within the same context, and especially within the same book, because it's the same writer, we assume. But then the question is, and there is one interpretation, as I mentioned, that in Daniel 11, then verse 5, once you have the breakup of the 4 winds into the 4 Greek kingdoms, then one interpretation takes verse 5 to be then the papacy, for the reason that I gave, based upon the structure in Daniel 8. But what we need to ask the panel is this, and that is to say, what is the relationship between verses 4 and 5? Who are these who's this king of the south? And then there's a king of the north in verse 6. Does this completely skip over the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, the way that one view would have it? Or is this really the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, the way almost all interpreters take it, preterists, historicists, and everyone?
Before we try to answer that question, again, I want to come to these issues first and foremost from Daniel's perspective. So what does Daniel see? He sees conflict between the king of the north and the king of the south. So as we see the whole trajectory, we note a point that Daniel is actually making before we go to the historical application. It's always the king of the north that attacks the faithful. So this is the first thing that Daniel sees before I don't want us to bypass what is actually happening in the text.
You're right. And I didn't intend for that.
I know you didn't.
I agree with you, Jerome, that always the text profile is what has to govern any application. So I'm just raising the question in terms of the application, so we go back to the text and evaluate that.
Sure. So before we start going to the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, I just want to make that point that what Daniel is saying is that there's this conflict. And as my brother Samuel pointed out, that it's Daniel's concern, for his people, for the Messiah, for the holy things of God. And if you just follow the trajectory of the text, I think the first point that we have to see is that Daniel is seeing that the conflict against the people of God, against God himself, is coming from the king of the north. Once we have established that, and we have seen that's the flow of the text, then we can start asking these historical questions. And then that can be a control mechanism for how we understand historical applications, because it has to be what is happening in terms of the conflict against the people of God. It's just, we can't randomly grab things from history and say, oh, it fits here, it fits here. But what is the concern that Daniel is having addressed by the angel? And that's the conflict against his people, the conflict against the Messiah, the conflict against the holy things of God. So now that we have at least had a consciousness of concern that Daniel has, now we can start, I think, trying to get a sense of how do we even answer those questions when it comes to the historical application.
But as Dr. Roy has said, that you can read almost any interpreter of this chapter, and the history of the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Syria, there's almost universal agreement, verse by verse, as we go from verse 4 onwards, down, for at least 10 verses on the interpretation of this, the battles between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. Almost every interpreter of every stream of interpretation agrees on that.
So the question is really sort of syntactical, grammatical, semantic. What is there a close language relationship between these kingdoms divided toward the four winds of heaven, which are Greek, and then the king of the south? Is there any connection between them, or is this king of the south just sort of pulled out of air and it's just somewhere else?
Mm-hmm. Amanda?
Well, I don't know if this is on. Oh, it is. Okay. So in verse 4, we have the horns going towards the, sorry, not the horns, but the kingdom being broken up into the four winds. And as we saw earlier, four winds has a tendency to mean the compass points. So now we're talking about, okay, it was broken up into these compass points. Now we're talking about specific compass points, south and north. So I think just the fact that that phrase actually means different directions on the compass, so to speak, that is a strong indicator that that's related to verse 4.
And as the ancient Jews knew, the invasions of Israel normally came from the direction of the north or from the direction of the south as people moved around the Fertile Crescent. It makes sense from Daniel's perspective to be talking about north and south rather than, say, east and west. Brother Brendan has a comment, then we'll come to Brother Tarsee.
So there's kind of three different ways of looking, and they're not all mutually exclusive, of the north and south. They can be, as you were mentioning, compass points, which has a lot of validity because of the connection of the two verses and the proximity. There's also the question, are they north and south in relation to each other? You know, is north north of south and south is south of north? That one seems to be a little bit of circular reasoning. Or, as has been brought out, is by Jerome, the context here is Israel. In fact, in chapter 10, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen to your people. And so this is a very Israel-centric discussion that's going on, interpretation that's going on. So is it north and south? Because if we just go on its own, north and south, out of the four compass points, the Lysimachus was really the northern of the four Diadochi divisions, not Seleucus, until he took it over, whereas Seleucus was more the ancient area of Babylon, which itself has called, the Babylonian king was called the king out of the north from an Israel perspective. So is there something to do with that ancient idea that Assyria and Babylon are the prototypes or the archetypes of this idea of a king of the north, and therefore is north and south in relation to Israel, not just in relation to each other, and not just compass points?
So when I say compass points, I don't mean like literally, looking at a map with latitude and longitude, exactly true north, true south. But in terms of the geographical location of Israel, and I think Roy's got a map up there, you can see that when they were attacked by Assyria, Babylon, those armies, even though technically maybe at some point were south, at least Babylon, they came from the north because they went around the Fertile Crescent, not through the desert. And Egypt is not exactly due south of Israel either, but it is when the Egyptian pharaohs would come up to conquer in that area, they came from the south. So it's not exactly a, perfect GPS locator kind of a compass point. So compass isn't really a great use, maybe not the best word to use, but it is talking about directions.
Yeah, in Jeremiah 1 verse 4, Amanda's absolutely right. Jeremiah 1 verse 14, and Tim Rosenberg pointed this out to me yesterday. Then the Lord said to me, Jeremiah, out of the north disaster shall be let loose upon all the inhabitants of the land, which means that the north is the direction from which that power enters the land of Israel. That's what's relevant, and that's why some are called the king of the north. It's true that the Seleucid Empire included a lot of Asia Minor, stretched over to India at one point. It was very, very much to the east, but it was also to the north, and when they came and they entered into the land of Israel, they came from the north, because here's all desert, as Amanda said. They had to come from this direction, and then from Egypt, the south. Everyone comes either from the north or from the south, if they're coming by land to the land of Israel.
Okay. Brother Tarsee?
You asked the question whether we know that the king of the south is one of the four that broke up from the great king. Well, when a new entity is introduced in Hebrew, there's a way in which that's normally done. Now, Daniel is post-exilic Hebrew in some ways, and so Daniel is late Hebrew, which doesn't follow all the rules of early and classical Hebrew. But still, you would expect a new person or a new entity to be introduced by being placed first in a sentence in Hebrew. And that's not what you have here. So in verse 5, you have the normal word order, which is the verb comes first, and then you have the subject, and which tells me nothing new is being introduced here. It must be one of those four.
Good point. Thank you.
That's a very important point. I mean, some people say this is the introduction of the papacy, which would be a whole new kind of power. But what you're saying, Brother Tarsee, is that how the sentence is structured indicates that this is one of the existing, or coming out from the existing powers.
Yes. It's a continuation
Yes.
rather than a new topic.
Okay.
Is this a conclusive argument? Do you always have a topic fronting?
Not always, but you would expect. In other words, you would naturally read it as a continuation.
Yeah.
So no, it doesn't happen 100% of the time. But it happens more, by the way, in pre-exilic Hebrew.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Brother Jerome?
Just a quick question with regard to the point that he made about verse 5, is how do we understand the previous clause, and to others besides these? Because I think that has an important factor in how do we understand now the relationship of the king of the north and the king of the south. Is it referring to the breakup towards these four directions, or is it referring to and to others besides these? I think we need to wrestle with that question before we start making the historical application.
Okay. Yes?
That is a good point, because the one who deviates says these three words are important.
In biblical Hebrew, especially when we are reading a predictive discourse as Daniel 11, when Gabriel used a Wekatal form, he was trying to indicate succession, continuity. Here in verse 5 is a Weyictol. The Weyictol, as far as I understand, indicates consequence or result. What Gabriel is saying, as a consequence of what I have said before, it will happen this: the king of the south will become strong. He is explaining about the continuation of Greece, just divided.
All right, does that answer your question, Brother Jerome? No.
I don't think that answers the question. I think, when you see the switches between the king of the south and king of the north, there's not always a Vayiktal. The grammar shifts. So sometimes you have Exkatal, sometimes you have Vakatal. So I'm not persuaded. I'm not saying it's not correct, but I just don't see that being a grammatical argument you can make throughout the whole chapter.
As we read the discourse of Daniel, if we find a Wekatal it indicates succession. If we read an ex-yictol clause, the ex-yictol clause indicates elaboration, description, explanation, etc. The verbal form weyictol appears several times in Gabriel's discourse, at least appears 7 or 8 times. And in every clause that has the weyictol form indicates consequence or result.
So the implications of what you're saying is that the verbal structure used indicates a continuation in verse 5 of the power of verse 4.
Yes, as a consequence of what happens before, then comes this.
And if it's if it's a continuation of what comes before, if what comes before is Alexandria's empire, then what's happening afterwards is happening within Alexander's empire, hence the Ptolemies and the Seleucids.
Yes, the empire was divided, and after it was divided into 4 lower kingdoms, now is pointing to the kingdom of the north and later on to the kingdom of the south.
Okay, thank you. Amanda?
But if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying that the verb beginning at verse 5 is a vayictol, is that what you're saying?
Yes.
But it's not. It's a vayictol. It's a vav conjunction, not a vav consecutive.
I didn't say vayictol, just vayictol.
Okay, I'm sorry, I just wanted to clarify what you were saying.
Well,
It's the difference between
these. I think we need to talk just for a moment about the acharito, the question that Jerome asked, and what he was saying was the implications of this, that his kingdom, who is that? Whose kingdom is that? Well, it's the kingdom of Alexander the Great, right? Okay, but let's skip the history, all right? If that's the case, then this individual, this king, whoever that is, then his kingdom is broken and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not to his afterpart, that is his posterity, apparently his descendants. He doesn't establish a dynasty, is what the text is saying, right? And not according to his power, because it's split up. None of them have his power. They all wanted it, and they tried to get it for the next couple hundred years. And that's why they fought, that with which he ruled, because his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others besides these referring to his posterity. Now, it's true that that word for posterity or afterpart is a singular, and these is a plural. But when you realize that the acharito, the singular can be a collective, collective referring to a group, then it's no grammatical problem. And what it's saying is that this king did not manage to establish a dynasty, and the kingdom was broken to others besides his descendants. That's what it's saying, right? Do we have agreement on that?
At least from me, yes.
You agree? Okay, we can have a vote. What do you think, Martin?
I think that must be the explanation that the plural ele refers back to the referent behind the descendant, his descendant. I can understand that this other colleague would say it does not. Because grammatically it is difficult. But if you say it's a collective singular and it's like the people is singular, and you can refer back to it with a plural if you want to stress there are many references within the And probably you should say Alexander, whoever that king is, he had some descendants, plural. Maybe that was expected for a king to have many who would come after him, and no one of these the kingdom is given to. By the way, how many descendants did Alexander have?
he had mainly one infant son who was murdered, wasn't he? Murdered?
Yeah.
But this idea would be referring to
So
what you're
history
saying.
would not be a good thing to start with, right, at this time?
What was that again?
History would not be a good idea to start with to explain what it means,
No,
because
no.
we do not have these. There are no more than.
But as
so
you said,
language.
it's expected that a king is going to have a lot of different descendants because he had many.
Do we not
wives
see in the
and
New
so-
Testament the Apostle Paul discusses God's promises to Abraham and to his seed, and God's promise to Eve and her seed, but the Apostle Paul narrows it down just to Jesus in Galatians chapter 3. We normally read the offspring of Eve in Genesis 3 and the promises to Abraham in Genesis 12 as plural, but Paul narrows it down to just the one offspring, that is Jesus Christ, in Galatians 3. We see a similar plural concept, but an individual application. Can we move on to the next passage where there seems to be agreement? And if you're smiling because these are the agreement passages, well, if we were doing marriage counseling, we'd say this is a marriage that has much opportunity for growth. But the next agreement passage that we come across is chapter 11, verses 31 through 35. And when we look across Adventist interpreters, and many of them are here today, who've published in this area, there is a general sense that 31 through 35, and we may differ in some of the details, but this is referring to Papal Rome, the union of church and state in its spiritual and physical persecution of the saints of God. And yes, we have a hand raised here. If you can give us your name, brother, and then Pastor Kelly will bring you the microphone. And gentlemen, raise your hand again. But this is a passage where there seems to be general agreement that we're talking about the persecution of the saints by Papal Rome. So, brother, if you can give us your name and your comment.
Yes, my name is Odika Walker. As I looked, I'm kind of going back a little, just before we move to verses 31 on. I'm looking at the text leading up to verse 22, and I am seeing where reference made to the king of the north. He affected the people of God. He imposed taxes on the glorious land, and then he caused he swept away and broken is used in terms of his activity, and that activity even affected the prince of the Holy Land. So it would appear to me that the power that would affect the people of God, that would impose taxes on the glorious land and affect the prince of the Messiah, that power would not be able to come out of Greece. It doesn't appear so to me. So we would be, to me, there would be a connection with Rome there.
Good. We'll get there. Yeah, that's good. So in other words, we've pretty much established, I think, that this text moves from Alexander the Great in verse 3 through verse 4, the broken kingdom, into verse 5 and following. And then the question is, how far do we go with the Seleucids and the Ptolemies from the north and the south? And there are different points at which Adventist scholars bail out and go to Rome. And so we have to discuss that. And definitely, though, however, it has to be before, or at least by, verse 22, which is your point, which is the death of Christ, because Christ died under imperial Rome. But of course, that's combining history and text again. But we're going to get there. Yeah.
In verse 31, the English reads, "They shall take away the daily sacrifice," or just the daily, and place there the abomination of desolation. And almost universally, Adventist interpreters identify this as referring to the papal era of the 1260 years of supremacy in Europe and persecution of the saints. If we ask our scholars here, is that a warranted conclusion based on the language that we see here? Yes.
I think that we should look in Gabriel's discourse where enters Rome into his discourse, either pagan Rome or papal Rome. According to my studies, pagan Rome starts in Daniel 11:21. And from verse 21, the contemptible person or vile person continues active in the discourse of Gabriel until verse 45. From Daniel 11:21 till verse 45, Gabriel describes the action of the contemptible person. And from my point of view, we should start at that place and see where pagan Rome finishes and when starts papal Rome. And then we can decide if that verse speaks about papal Rome or about pagan Rome.
Okay, thank you.
Now, I know we want to focus on the text first rather than interpretation, but I'm just throwing this out. Depending on how you want to interpret it, what do we make of the King of the South beginning in verse 25? And how does that fit into the way we interpret Rome, whether it's papal or pagan?
I think we're going to get sidetracked into the controversial text if we do that, the divergence text. The question from Conrad was, we have an...
You're right.
What we thought was, and this is a question, this is a test, if this is really true, but what some of us at least thought was general agreement on these verses and their language and their intra-textual relation to Daniel 8. Because in Daniel 8, we get similar language. See, forces from him shall appear, and so on and so forth, shall take away the... Burnt offering is not in the text. It just says the regular, or the regularity. And we can talk about the meaning of that, or maybe we won't. But in any case, in verse, back in Daniel 8, see, what is the power? Do we agree on which power takes away, I'll make that a little smaller there, which is the power that takes away the regular, the tamid? And there's pretty much general agreement in Adventism that tamid is taken away by the papacy, right? That this is all talking about the papacy here. So then the question is, can we assume that because that language is used there, and then there's the setting up of the abomination of desolation, the desolating abomination in Daniel 8:13, it refers to the transgression that makes desolate. Persia is a rebellious sin that makes desolate. Therefore, we can come to 11:31 and say, within the stream of the flow of the narrative flow of the prophecy of this interpretation in Daniel 11, we have arrived at least by this point, we've arrived at the papacy. And then we can go back and we can look at the details.
Yeah, we may have arrived at pagan or papal Rome before this verse, but in terms of like a junction point in time, can we agree that by 31 we're looking at the papal supremacy of the 1260 years? That's the essential question here.
I said before that Daniel's concern was God's people, the people of the covenant. And we must study where Gabriel talks about the temple of Jerusalem that would be destroyed according to Daniel 8, explained in Daniel 9. In Daniel 9, the explanation of Gabriel is the city of Jerusalem and the sanctuary will be destroyed. it is the heavenly sanctuary that would be destroyed. It would be the Jerusalem of above that would be destroyed, or it is the temple of Jerusalem and the city of Jerusalem that would be destroyed according to Daniel 9:26. If Daniel 11 is an explanation of Daniel 8, we must look at what point Gabriel explains about the destruction of the temple, about the desolation of the people of Israel. Till verse 21, I have not seen the explanation of Gabriel.
Okay.
I come back to what Roy said. In my dissertation, I showed about 15. There might be more relationships between Daniel 8 and Daniel 11, between the little horn in Daniel 8 and the king of the north, starting from verse 30, 31. And it's very interesting to see that there are almost no relations to the Daniel 8, 9 to 14 text from the verses before. So from verses 4 to, let's say, I think the first one would be in verse 27. There are no linguistic similarities for important words. Which shows to me, when you come to around verse 30 or 31, you are dealing with a power which is described in similar language like the little horn in Daniel 8. If that would allow us to say it is the same interpretative referent, then we would go further. Does it? That's the question. Yes, there is almost universal agreement, but I know of at least one person who sees Daniel 11:31 as the text to which Jesus refers to in Matthew 24, verse 15. When he refers back not to Daniel 9, as we Adventists usually say, because he says from the Greek, it is a same kind of exact quote from Daniel 11:31. So I don't know if you go in that direction. Help me here, but
yes,
this person sees here the destruction of Jerusalem, so to speak, as a typical event for the destruction, or the attempted, we should say, the attempted destruction of the heavenly temple, which is referred to in Daniel 8. Now, I do not believe this is true, because the references in the language are so clear at this point to the little horn in Daniel 8 that I think this should be the little horn here. This king of the north is the same as the little horn in Daniel 8.
Okay. If we are trying to look for parallelisms of Daniel 8 and Daniel 11, in Daniel 8, verse 9, it says that the little horn would come out from one of them. Then it says, it shall go to the south, to the east, and to the beautiful. Where the king of the north in Daniel 11 first goes to the south, where it goes to the east, and where it goes to the beautiful. There we should start.
Looking at the text, I'm not sure if sure.
Can you speak up, Brother Tarsee?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I don't mean to switch the topic on this, but we are assuming something. Again, going back to the distinction between classical Hebrew and late biblical Hebrew, it's very easy in a classical Hebrew narrative to tell the distinction between when the story is moving forward, it's the next event in time, and when things stop and you just have a series of clauses that just describe something. But this is post-exilic Hebrew. This is late biblical Hebrew. And the clues aren't always there. But I do ask the question, is there a lot of temporal progression going on here? Or do we have a big, long description that's not necessarily in temporal sequence?
I will answer Dr. Li's question. It is true. Historical narrative in biblical Hebrew, if the clause begins with a guayictol verb form, the guayictol indicates succession in historical narrative. In standard Hebrew, predictive discourse, if the clause starts with a guecatal verbal form, it indicates succession. The same applies in the book of Daniel. In Daniel 8 is a vision report. It's similar to historical narrative. In Daniel 8, we find the guayictol verbal form indicating succession, continuity. In Daniel 11, it's not historical narrative. It is predictive discourse. And if the guecatal verbal form initiates the clause, indicates succession, continuity. If the clause starts with a particle or a noun, and then comes the verb yictol, it indicates elaboration, explanation, contrast, etc. I see in the book of Daniel how it is biblical, late biblical Hebrew, also follows the same grammatical rule of classical Hebrew.
Yeah, but if we do that, then we need to see how that works out. I'm not sure it does, but that's why I'm asking.
I think we need to get back to the question, which we have been overlooking in verses 31 to 35. If this is, as Dr. Probstle Martin was saying, if this does relate to the papacy passage in chapter 8, then what about the following verses? He, that is, he, if that's the papacy, the little horn, shall seduce with flattery those who vow the covenant, and so on. And then many days they will, or some days they'll stumble by sword, flame, captivity, plunder. Is that a persecuting power? Is that little horn a persecuting power in chapter 7 and chapter 8? Does that fit with that same power? Mm-hmm. And then they'll receive a little help. Many will join themselves to them with flattery. What does that mean? And then after we figure out what the text means, we can talk about the history. Some of the wise shall stumble. Stumbling can refer to death. In verse 19, it refers to the end of a particular power, a particular king. We can find out who that is. So they'll be refined, purified, made white until the time of the end, for it awaits the appointed time. So that passage there, what's that really talking about in relation to chapters 7 and 8?
May I just follow up here, because the reason why I mentioned the question of whether there's temporal sequence or not is related to what you were raising here. Do these things have to happen after the setting up of the abomination of desolation? That's where I was going with those comments.
Okay, Amanda?
So to your question, is this a persecuting power? If you look just at verse 30, which is not one of our anchor texts, but it's immediately preceding our anchor text here, it talks about the power becoming enraged and taking action against the Holy Covenant, which sounds very specifically like a power that is persecuting a religious people group. And it also seems to be maybe one of the texts that Revelation later is maybe has in mind with the woman and her seed, and then when he's not able to, the water comes out and the water is absorbed into the earth, and he's upset about it, the dragon, right? He goes and makes war.
So Amanda, what you're saying, the text, verse 30, it seems to be referring to a persecuting power, persecuting the people of God.
Yes.
That may parallel the persecuting power of Revelation 12.
Yes.
Where the woman seeks refuge in
Right,
the wilderness.
which would be a later, discussion of this. Not that we're trying to get into Revelation yet, because that's a little premature, but I'm just saying, I think this text might have been one that Revelation had in mind.
All right, so we need to take a break now. Martin had his hand on the buzzer before we go for a break. If you take a final comment, Martin, then we'll take a break, and then we'll continue.
I hope you like my final comment. For the audience, and you correct me if I understand this wrong now. What we are doing here is going through the anchor texts, and the anchor texts are texts which anchor in history. Is that right?
Yes.
In the interpretation?
They anchor in intertextual relationship within the book of Daniel. That's the question. The history is subordinate to the textual issue.
That's right.
Yeah.
But of course, he's asking, is it papal Rome? Mm-hmm. Because we know from Daniel 8, the Lord is papal Rome. But what Tarsee was raising here is actually very important. Now, if I would really have no audience here, if it would just be us here, I would suggest, you know what? We need to go to the text and look at all the verbs and go through and decide from the verbs what the structure is. But if we do that, we'll be here until tonight. And of course, we are not going into the questions here on the right side.
Our audience can look at this when they want to sleep.
But actually, this would methodologically be the best way. I mean, as I see it, I'm an exegete. I'm not a historian, and I do not want history be leading me in any way. Of course, it's important to have history in mind because it talks about real events, In the end, there needs to be a give and take from both sides. But still, I would start with the text. So I would support Tarsee here and say, let's go and do this. But I know that this is tedious for the audience. This will be...
Well, I think
as Alonso Schödel said, once president of the SPL, share the fruit, not the sweat. Yeah. But it's almost important to just share the fruit in Daniel 11 because we want to know how these people sweat.
Maybe we should point out that what we're doing with these anchor texts is not to try to nail it permanently. What we're trying to do is say, this is where there's just has been general agreement, and does that sort of make sense? And then we're going to test all of that when we go through the text with the divergence text. So it doesn't mean that we're locked in any way. It's just a procedure that sort of makes sense so that we can gain the general overview of the overall progression that has been seen among Adventist interpreters generally, and that's going to make things a little more clear for our audience. And then we'll go back through these details and test those things to some extent by looking at the others. They have to fit in, otherwise we'll throw them out, right?
Okay, Pastor Kelly?
Yeah, and I also just want to comment that yesterday when Dr. Fortin was here, we went through 3 historicist elements of interpreting. And so the texts matter immensely, but there are these components of history and the rest of the book of Daniel that do set some parameters, and they don't force themselves on this chapter in an illegitimate way, but they do bring a serious point of reference to the chapter too. It's kind of a safety net at some level not an absolute directive, but an imbalance. So I just want to make sure we are enjoying this and learning immensely. But it is in the context of those threefold things. So we appreciate what's happening. It's been very, very good.
We'll take a break now, but while we're taking a break, this is a half semi-humorous comment. You know how they produced the Septuagint, the myth? They locked them away somewhere and said, don't come out until you've translated the Old Testament. You have a Greek translation. Maybe we need to lock this group away for a week in May or June and say, you do not come out until you have a translation with an interpretation. But so we'll take a 10-minute break. Now we're back at 25 past.
There are 7 of us, you know.
7 minutes. All right. So let's Johnny be quick to the restroom, and we'll be back at 25 past.
But that was
Conrad?
That was a
gather back together, everybody, please. All right, if we could join back together for our final session before our lunch is prepared for us. We have about 25 minutes to delve into something a bit more deeply now, as we invite our scholars to come back to the table. And I think in the interest of time, if we could please take your seats and conclude our discussions. In the interest of time, we're going to assume that we can all agree that Daniel 12, 1, 2, and 3 refer to the second coming of Jesus and the final time of trouble. On that basis, we will move back to some of the disagreement texts, start moving into those. So, Pastor Rosenberg, can you take your seat? And Pastor Martin, if we can invite you back to the lectern here, we will continue with our journey. Yes. So welcome back, Brother Martin.
Yes.
And as an earlier Brother Martin said, here I stand, I can do no other. So we'd like to invite the panel to focus, as you look at your handout here, to focus on the areas of disagreement. And the first significant area that we want to explore is, when does Rome come onto the scene in this chapter? Because historically, many Adventist interpreters have taken the idea that Rome appears much earlier than someone like Pastor Roy Gane argues. The argument has been that Rome appears with Pompey standing in the beautiful land, the conquest of Israel, and so many Adventists have argued that in verse 16, that he who comes against him shall take the actions he pleases, and no one shall withstand him. He shall take a position in the beautiful land, and all of it shall be in his power. And that verse has often been used by Adventists to argue this is the arrival of Rome, Pompey conquering Palestine or Israel in about 63 BC. On the other hand, there is a divergent view espoused initially, I think, by Roy Gane and others now, that we're looking in these verses all the way up to about verse 20, is that right? 19. We are not looking at the arrival of Rome with Pompey and Julius Caesar being the one who will stumble and fall and not be found in verse 19 in the Ides of March. But this is actually the story of Antiochus III Magnus the Great. And as we heard yesterday in Brother Brendan's presentation, this is almost a form of internal type and before the death of Jesus in verse 22 of what follows later on in the chapter. And so this is an area of significant discussion. When does Rome arise in this chapter? Because we've identified the Persians, we know they're the Greeks, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. So now we come to the question of, where does Rome appear in this chapter? And maybe to start the conversation, Roy, can you explain to us briefly why you believe that this is Antiochus Magnus from verse 14 onwards?
Yes. Verse 14 is the first place that, aside from that one interpreter who starts the papacy in verse 5, Rome, and even skips over imperial Rome, but other interpreters, and there's Uriah Smith, there's Mervyn Maxwell, there's Shea and others, and there's varying interpretations. But the first place that Adventist interpreters then have gone to pagan Rome is in verse 14. And the interpretation is really that of Uriah Smith, the violent ones among, but he's using a different translation. He says, the robbers of your people. And he says, the robbers of your people, meaning those who robbed your people. And those who robbed your people are the Romans, because they dominated them and then they stole from them. So the question there is whether this, here's the Hebrew expression, paritse amecha, this is one of those constructs. It's literally the violent ones of your people. Doesn't necessarily mean robbers. It can mean violent ones. And what does that of mean? Does that mean that they were robbing from them? Or does it mean that they were violent among your people? Excuse me. So we need to look at that for a moment.
All right, so can we start looking at that then?
Could I just say that the expression actually begins with the word before it, the sons of the violent ones of your people, and but that's part of the expression.
Yeah, good. So how do we answer that syntactically, semantically, and so on? We have, as I think you said, Jerome, we can't just look at one word by itself.
Sure.
We have to look at the combination.
Sure, thanks. And I was just about to address that. What word do we see in verse 14 that we've heard before? If you keep reading, it says, they will raise themselves in order, you can take that as a lamed of purpose, in order to establish the Hazon. So then the next question is this talking referring back to what's happening in Daniel 8? So then we have to say, well, when Daniel talks about the Hazon, what is he talking about? And I think he's talking about the whole vision, the ram, the goat, the little horn. I don't think you can jump straight from here to history, but I do think that this is a clear indication of, you know, what he's referring to about these violent people trying to establish this Hazon. So what is it that they're trying to make stand or to establish? I think that question will have to be answered first for us to really say at what period of time. Because if you take the Maccabean revolt, just some people take the Maccabean revolt as a historical focus here. How were they trying to establish the vision? You see, so if you have a historical reference point, you then have to answer the question, in what sense are they taking this action? That would be my concern.
Yeah, that's good. And the other question, of course, is this somebody being persecuted? That is to say, are they doing the violence to your people, or is it the people who are doing the violence? That's a question.
Yeah, it seems like, again, I have to always be careful because not everything that applies to classical Hebrew applies to post-exilic Hebrew, but you have verse 14 beginning with a temporal expression, in those times, okay? And then you have the subject, okay, many. And then you have the verb, finally. So it's kind of almost, you've got a switching gear, so to say. And so I don't know if Rome starts here or not, but the way verse 14 starts does allow for that, okay? But as you read on, you find that the next sentence begins with that expression that we're talking about, okay? And the sons of the violent ones of your people. Whatever that means, again, you have the fact that the verb doesn't begin that sentence. It's the subject that's beginning that sentence. And then we come to the expression to establish. That can be misleading because what you have is an infinitive in Hebrew, and it's very tempting to translate an infinitive in Hebrew with an infinitive in English, to establish. But that may not be the meaning of it, because the Hebrew infinitive can often have a more adverbial meaning, establishing, rather than in order to establish. And so it may actually be referring to the fact that many will rise up against the king of the south, etc., in parenthesis, thus establishing the Hazon. But, you know, those are just ideas. I'm not bound to that. I'm just noticing the syntax here.
For the sake of our audience, could somebody explain the difference? There's a Mara vision and a Hazon vision in Daniel 8 and 9. Can somebody explain for our audience the significance of these two words, how they're used?
Yeah, maybe it's easier to do it with accordance here. At the beginning of Daniel 8, we have the whole vision of the ram and the he-goat is called a chazon. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me. There's the word chazon, and I'm showing it on the screen, okay? And so this whole thing is a vision. And then we have this little, it's been called an audition by some Adventist interpreters, where you have the question, then I heard a holy one speaking. Another holy one said to the one who spoke. So Daniel is witnessing a dialogue between apparently heavenly beings. For how long is the vision, and so on and so forth, and then the answer is given, 2,300 evenings and mornings, which has the time element in all of this. Then in verse, okay, so when Daniel had seen the vision, okay, when I'd seen the chazon, that's referring to the whole thing. But then, down in verse 26, it uses a different expression, and that is the expression mar'eh, which is a synonym for chazon, meaning vision, but it's a different word. And this is referring to the time element. In other words, that little subpart of the vision. It's true that these words actually are synonyms, but here, this is used in a particular way in this context. The mar'eh is that time element with that little dialogue. Then when Gabriel comes in 9:20, Gabriel, I have to use 2 hands. All right, I need 3 hands. While I was speaking and praying and so on, and then Gabriel comes and he says, he made me understand, Daniel, I've come to give you insight and understanding. Therefore, consider the word and understand the, what? Vision. And that's the same word, mar'eh, as the time element. That's what Daniel didn't understand, because in 8:27, he was very disturbed about the vision, the mar'eh. Okay, I was appalled by the mar'eh. What he especially disturbed him was that time element, because he wanted to know when his people are going to be restored. So when we find over here, we're talking about to establish the chazon, then this would be talking about that overall vision. To establish that, what would that mean? And who would that be who would do that? We couldn't imagine anyone but the Jewish people doing it, and so that's the way it's usually interpreted.
Okay.
You asked me, though, Conrad, earlier, why do I reject this? And I say that this could not refer to Rome introduced here or in 16. 16 is generally, most Adventist interpreters say that this is the Romans coming in, and they take over the glorious land, which is the land of Palestine. They say this is the time of Pompey the Great, came in 63 BC, took over Palestine. I reject that because as a result of introducing Rome, Adventist interpreters then go in verse 17 and they say, he shall give him the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom. And they say, aha, who's the really prominent Greek woman in this period? It's got to be Cleopatra the Seventh. Now that's the Elizabeth Taylor Cleopatra. That is to say, from the movie Cleopatra, okay? But there were lots of Cleopatras, just like there was a whole string of Ptolemies. And the Cleopatras, there was even a Cleopatra from the north, so they could be from the north or the south. So Adventist interpreters have taken this to be the last Cleopatra, who messed around with Julius Caesar, had a son by him, and then Mark Antony. And she was the last of the Ptolemies, except for her young son, who was then killed. That's wrong, because, and I'm dogmatic about that, not most things, but I am about that, because it says, he shall give him the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom. Cleopatra the Seventh was never given in marriage by anybody. She went and met Julius Caesar by having herself wrapped up in a roll of carpet and then unrolled as a present before him because he didn't want to see her. And furthermore, are we talking about the north or the south? Here it is the king of the north who stands in the glorious land. He shall set his face to come. He shall perform terms of an agreement. This is king of the north, gives his daughter from the north to the king of the south to destroy the kingdom. To me, this is an anchor point. It's a very specific description of a historical event. This is Antiochus III giving his daughter, Cleopatra I, in marriage to Ptolemy V from the south. This is still in the time of Antiochus III. Therefore, Rome is not introduced in verse 16 or verse 14. But I introduce Rome as the commander in verse 18 who puts an end to Antiochus' insolence as he goes up and tries to take the coastlands of Turkey and Greece and so on. And then this commander, yes, Roman commander, defeated him at the battles of Thermopylae and Magnesia. And then as a result, he lost all of those territories, had to pay crippling tribute, and his son Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the Antiochus Epiphanes, was a hostage in Rome as a result of that. So this is really the end of the expansion of the Seleucid Empire. We reach the height of it under Antiochus III, and then Rome comes in and starts to dominate. That's the way I take it. So anybody can, the target is on the chest, you can start shooting away, but that's the way I see it.
Let me ask the question, because Jerome raised the question about the fulfillment of the vision. He said that's the verse we've seen out before in Daniel. In what sense was the life and career of Antiochus III, how do we see that being fulfilled in relation to Daniel 8?
Well, this is the time of Ptolemy V, who was a boy king. And there's many shall rise against the king of the south. That's true, that happened. That's when the famous inscription that was found, the bilingual inscription, the Rosetta Stone, found by the soldiers of Napoleon in 1799, that was written during the time of Ptolemy V, and it has to do exactly with that time when there was an uprising. Now, we don't exactly know what it means about the violent ones among your people will lift themselves up to fulfill the vision. We didn't know exactly what that is historically. Don't have a good reference point. But within this framework, it would apparently be during that time period.
All right, thank you. Yes, let's take our brother from Australia, then we'll take Brother Michael here.
So it seems some of the things that would either support, like your thesis, Roy, would rise or fall on. The main one is going to be in verse 16, but before that, the violent ones either being a subjective or an objective construct. Right. In your paper on the unmanifestation of Antiochus Epiphanes, you do argue for a subjective construct, so the violent ones among your people as opposed to violent ones against your people. Mm-hmm. And the same construct relationship is actually found in chapter 12, verse 1, sons of your people. It's just no longer has the sons of the violent ones of your people. So it's just taken out that one word. So it seems to me that whether we see it as objective or subjective, we would have to be consistent sons against your people or sons among your people in chapter 12, verse 1, if we're doing sons of violent ones against or among in chapter 11, verse 14. Does that ring true?
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Thank you.
Just for context. But then the main thing, and I want to hear what everyone has to say, for Rome to be introduced by a pronoun attached to a verb in verse 16, he who comes against, that doesn't seem to be something that would be normal in Hebrew. It would need to be an explicit subject before that for the he to be referring to. Otherwise, the he should refer to the previous subject, which is the king of the north, and the reflexive him referring to the previous object, which was the king of the forces of the south. Would that make sense?
Well, if you're asking me, and we can hear from Tarsee on the grammar.
All around.
Let's hear from Tarsee first.
Well, I was going somewhere else, so
let's hear from Roy first. Roy ask a question, then Brother Tarsee.
I agree that you have the king of the north comes against the king of the south, which shall not stand, or even his best troops, for there shall be no strength to stand. And then the contrast, but he who comes against him, that's the king of the north, right? Shall do as he wills. None shall stand before him. He shall stand in the glorious land. And this is the first time, Antiochus III is the first time when the land of Israel passes into the hands of the Seleucids. Before this, it's been in the hands of the Ptolemies. So and this did happen historically, and it fits the text.
Brother Tarsee, and then Brother Michael.
Yeah. Going back to the question of the kind of genitive construction you have here, I guess I didn't make myself clear. If the second sentence in verse 14 is a backgrounded sentence, it seems to lend support to the idea that these are people who are part of the rebellion. In other words, many rise up against the king of the south, and then in parentheses, it includes the sons of violence of your people, they will rise up to, and that's where I was going with that.
Well, yeah,
by the way.
and from a grammatical point of view, you see the clause then starts with ubnei paritse amicha. It doesn't start with the verb. So it's not just continuing, it's parenthetical here. So I totally agree. But I guess one question could be, this word paritz, what does it mean elsewhere? And we have another verse, paritz hayot. What does this mean? Is it the violent ones against the animals or the violent ones of the animals? There will not be there a lion, and the paritz of the animals, that would be like the lion, right? The ferocious one, the violent one of the animals would be in parallelism with the lion, right? Rather than the violent ones, well, I guess you could say it's the violent one against the animals here in that sense as well. You could say either way it could go. So you can't really totally determine that. You've got another one here, but it's not in construct, so it doesn't really help so much. This is really the only one in construct.
Yeah, the construct can go either way. So the fact that it's construct doesn't really tell us anything.
That's right.
But the context here seems to suggest more one
That's
or the
it.
other.
That's the point.
So what I'm hearing you say is that the second half of this verse, 14, violent men of your people shall exalt themselves in fulfillment of the vision, that's really just an echo statement, a parenthetical explanatory note of the first half of that sentence. Am I hearing you right there?
Yes.
Okay. Do you all agree with that as a group? I mean,
not necessarily explanatory of it, but it's just something that happened there. It's a little footnote.
All right. Michael?
Well, some of it has just been said, as Tarsee has pointed out. Verse 14 does begin with a vav disjunctive. This is somewhat indicating that something in the narrative has shifted. So you seem to have, as most critical scholars agree, and I agree, you have the story of Antiochus III being told, and then all of a sudden, and we don't want to go to history too soon. We never want to go to history too soon, but this verse would come right at the moment as it's preparing to share the apex of Antiochus III's reign, his power. So right as we get to the apex of his power, all of a sudden grammatically, when we're trying to come back to the text, we do have ubatim, which is a vav disjunctive. This represents some sort of narrative shift. It is a parenthetical. The whole sentence, the whole verse seems to be constructed in a way that it's an afterthought. You know, it's kind of telling there will be rebellions around those times. There's only one other precise occurrence of that, ubatim, in the Old Testament, and that's in 2 Chronicles 15:5, where it is used exactly in that way, as a very broad, summary kind of around those times statement. So there is some sort of, this is a parenthetical aside explaining the broader context of the narrative flow, which is Antiochus III's, at least this is widely agreed, Antiochus III's, the apex of his reign.
Well, miracle of miracles, I think we found agreement on a text, but Brother Ed Nelson?
Yeah.
And then over here.
Had regarding Daniel 11:14, I've heard it suggested before that this is the entrance of Rome, and I had dismissed it for a long time. And then I went and compared that verse with Ezekiel 7, and I found a lot of comparisons with Ezekiel 7 to be quite compelling. Ezekiel 7 is a passage where God is telling, I'm going to destroy my people, I'm going to destroy my secret places, I'm going to, the parits, the robbers are going to enter into my holy place because you have taken my glory, my sabid, the beautiful things I gave you, and you've made abominations and idols. And it talks about this being a chazon that will be fulfilled in the future. It has all of these linguistic connections that come back here. And so the more I thought about it and looked at this, I began to wonder, is this possibly talking about Rome in connection with that? And this is not something I've heard a lot of people discuss either. In Daniel 11, verse 10, this war between Antiochus III, as I understand it, and Ptolemy V, there's the battle, and it says that both of these, the very last part of the verse, will be stirred up to her fortress. The Hebrew is feminine there. It says her fortress, her ma'oz. And so to me, this is a reference that, and both of these kings were actually stirred up to the very doors of Jerusalem, and Ptolemy, as Josephus tells us, wanted to enter the temple, and he was told, no, you can't do this. So both of these kings were stirred up even to her fortress. And so I think this is giving us a view. I mean, if the angel told us, what I'm going to tell you is going to be about what will befall your people. And this isn't some random, disjointed, disconnected prophecy of two warring kings, north and south. It actually does, but I haven't heard many people talk about Daniel 11:10 as being the her fortress, as that these two kings were stirred up even to her fortress, which I believe is a reference to Jerusalem, because both north and south have been masculine, 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 masculine. Who is this her fortress? And then in verse 14, it talks about fulfillment of the vision.
Okay, just one little detail there. It's not her fortress. If you can see, I've highlighted up there the final hey on me'uz. Ma'oz is the word for fortress, but that final hey does not have a dot in it, which is, this is a technicality, a dot which is a mapik, which would indicate that that is a third feminine singular pronoun. Accordance is labeling that as a third masculine singular. In fact, in Hebrew, the hey, in older Hebrew, interestingly, the hey could represent the masculine singular, and so it's partly a matter of context, but the Masoretes did not take that as the third feminine singular there.
Yeah, so, I think you may have read in some commentaries perhaps where they suggest amending the text and adding that dot on the hey, and that would have made it a pronominal suffix. But in this case, it's simply the suffix in this case is masculine if you take a suffix. If you take it in the written form, there's a difference here between the text as it's written and the Masoretic reading tradition, which is the scribal reading tradition. And when we follow the scribal reading tradition, then you have a masculine suffix, his. However, the text as it's written has that letter at the end. The question is, does the letter at the end indicate the feminine form of the noun, which would be ma'uzah? It would not be a suffix. It would simply mean a fortress. Or would it be a pronominal suffix? And then the question is, in that form, do you have to add a dot, which would make it a feminine? Or is it simply, as Roy was saying, the more archaic way of writing the masculine suffix? So it's complicated.
Can I ask a lay question here? But those dots didn't exist when Daniel wrote this?
Right. There were no dots. So it's a question of how you interpret this.
So we're arguing about what the Masoretic scribes put in the 9th century AD, whether it's masculine or feminine, but in the original text there were no dots, there were no vowel pointings whatsoever.
There were no vowel points. However, we have both the feminine form and the masculine form as possible for the word.
Yeah.
So it could be ma'oz, but it could also be ma'uzah as the word without the suffix.
When you consult the Adoshan, so the translation, the Septuagint version of Daniel that's more closely aligned with the Hebrew text, not the Old Greek, but the Theodotion, it does use the third masculine singular of to. So yeah, we can say, oh, maybe in the 9th century they didn't think it was feminine, but also at this time, these translators also didn't think it was feminine. They thought it was masculine. So that's a clue. It's not definitive, but it's a clue.
Also, they had a very precise, long tradition of oral chanting, and they would have made a distinction between the sound of the hey with the mapik and without it, because with the mapik, it's a consonant. So that was a very long tradition. And those oral traditions, we could discount and say, well, they're not accurate because they're oral. That is not true. Also in Islamic tradition, the Quranic traditions of recitation, very precise, had incredible memories. In fact, there's my rabbinics teacher at Berkeley told me that likely Rabbi Judah the Patriarch redacted, that is, edited the entire Mishnah in 200 AD, orally to memorizers, professional memorizers.
There was one other item in connection with this. I agree with Dr. Gane on verse 17 that this the power there that is being corrupted is not Cleopatra the seventh, but I find interesting the verb that's used there that says that Shakath, that he will give him the daughter of women to destroy, that verb is used 3 times in Daniel 8. And it's not found anywhere else in the book of Daniel, but Daniel 8:24 says he will destroy fearfully, speaking of the little horn. Daniel 8:25 says he will destroy many in their prosperity, again speaking of the little horn. And Daniel 9:26 says he will destroy the city and the sanctuary, again the same verb. So when I come to verse 17, it seems to be a proleptic view of the destruction of Jerusalem, that this daughter of women, the daughter of Zion, and God's people are spoken of as 2 women, actually, in a passage in Ezekiel. I see God's people in view here as, proleptic view of them being destroyed.
The only question that I have is, keep track when you have King of the North doing the action. So if this is the King of the North, you're saying that God is using the King of the North to do something, utilizing the people of God. Am I understanding you correctly?
Well, the last time we hear about the King of the North is in verse 15. It's not mentioned beyond that. And I take the stance that in verse 16, that the he who comes against him is a Roman power now. And so the power in verse 17 that is going to destroy the daughter of women, I see as a Roman power.
Sure. My question is in terms of historical application. I'm just talking about in the flow of the whole chapter, you have the juxtaposition of the actions of the King of the North. Sometimes that can refer to one historical entity and then to a different one. And then you have the actions of the King of the South. So I'm just asking, in terms of your application, how does the actions of the King of the North, if we follow the text, fit into what you're saying? That's just what I wanted clarification on.
What I'm trying to say is the King of the North, the last action of the King of the North, quote, I see as in taking place in verse 15, and then the King of the North is not mentioned anymore. I don't see Rome defined as the King of the North in application in any of the verses that follow. I see Rome as introduced. Some people have said it's the King of the North, but I don't see that actually in the text. And so to me, that's a foreign concept.
So you just think King of the North, King of the South is just completely dropped, a new entity is introduced, and then later on in the book it picks back up?
Well, it is in verse 25. There's a subtle reference to both of these kings will sit at the same table. That's true. But I don't see Rome as the King of the North. No.
We're going to get into this more and more in terms of what are the antecedents of pronouns. That is to say, what do pronouns refer to? And when the power is introduced, we're going to see that the power of Rome, and then the little horn, the despicable person who's introduced in 21, we're going to see, once they're introduced, it's just he, him, right? Whether pronouns or subjects of verbs, which are, Hebrew is inflected, so they have first, second, or third person in a finite verb, which includes that he. And then you have objects of him and so on. And that just continues. You have that continuity. So that's why if you have Antiochus III, starting in verse 10 or so, whatever, moving all the way through, it's just the same he, him, King of the North. And then in verse 16, he who comes against him, Vaya'as, the one, Vaya'as, the one, that's the one, this is the subject of this participle here, comes against him, is just continuing the same power. And then he shall set his face, that's King of the North, that's Antiochus III, and so on. And so you don't have to name the King of the North, King of the South all the time to have that continuity. You can't say that when that term no longer appears, therefore you don't have that power, because it continues through the pronouns.
All right, it's almost time for lunch. We have one question here, then we'll take lunch. Yes.
Yeah, I was just going back to the Hazon in verse 14. The only place it's used in the chapter, to my knowledge. And so we've got to find out, what vision is that? And it would seem, since it's not used anywhere else in the chapter, that we've got to look outside the chapter because it's not mentioned anywhere else, so we don't have kind of a reference point. But if we go to the same verse in chapter 10, we have it used there, and it's only used one time in chapter 10 as well. And verse 14 of chapter 10 gives us the reason why Gabriel is there. He's there to make Daniel understand what's going to happen in the latter days. And then he says it's for the Hazon is for days to come, or for many days. And so this is a direct reference back to chapter 8, which is declared to be the vision for many days at the end of chapter 8. And so the vision that is being talked about in chapter 11, verse 14, is the vision of chapter 8. And there we see that a power is introduced in chapter 8 that are the robbers and breakers of God's people. We don't see in the vision of chapter 8 anywhere where God's people are violent. We see violence against God's people. And so linking verse 14 of chapter 11 with verse 14 of chapter 10 back to the introduction of the power that's the robber and breaker of God's people. Anyway, I'm just giving you my thinking on it, and you can toss that around.
I mean, this is an important point, because this is a divergence where people diverge in their interpretations. Is this the arrival of Rome on the scene, or is this Antiochus III? And at yesterday's presentation from Australia was also Brother Brenton Valiant was discussing this as one of the type-antitype within this chapter. And so this is a very important question. It is time for us to go for our lunch now.
Can I just mention one PS to that? And that is, that's the exegetical issue. Is it's true that some expressions do recur in Daniel. Sometimes they're in the same kind of context in which there are often multiple indicators. As 1131, we saw Martin Probstle has mentioned multiple indicators. Others, this lehashrit, this destruction, you can't say that because it's referring to destruction of Jerusalem here. For that reason, when the same verb appears, it's that. You got to look at the object, and the object is different. In this case, you got to look at the whole context. Just because you have the same word reappearing doesn't mean it's referring to the same thing. You have to have other contextual indicators as well.
All right, well, as you're going through lunch, maybe you can be thinking in your own minds, what is the significance of this Hazon? Is this referring back to the Hazon of Daniel 8 and of Daniel 10? And if so, what is the significance?
Are you suggesting that we should chew on it?
Yes.
Well, and why don't we also encourage the scholars to spread themselves out a little bit, so the dialogue that isn't really afforded here is afforded there. So, all right, let's ask the Lord to bless our meal, and then we hope you'll thank Stacy Gusky, who has made most of it for us. Let's pray. Thank you, Lord, for the free and open discussion, the stretching of minds, the sharing of points, the dialogue, the discourse. Thank you for the beautiful spirit you've provided. Now help us, Lord, as we get to clarify and dialogue even more intimately about these things. Bless these individuals on the platform here. Continue to give them sensitivity to spirit, sharpness of mind, and freedom of expression. And bless all of the rest of us that are listening and taking in and being changed by what we're hearing. We thank you now for the food. Bless it in the fellowship, we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, you can make your way down and get in line and begin enjoying